Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones hidden behind closed doors, stories of love, sacrifice, and the shocking twists that no one expects. What you're about to hear is based on real events, but to protect the privacy of those involved, I've changed their names and locations. This is not just another story, it's a journey into the quiet pain and incredible courage of ordinary people. So lean in, listen closely, and follow along. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the newest stories. Don't forget to like this video and leave a comment saying I'm listening so we can stay connected and travel through these stories together. Michael Turner adjusted his glasses as the gray Ohio sky turned to dusk. It was a crisp Saturday in early March, and the 2-hour drive from Dayton to Columbus felt longer than usual. He had woken up before sunrise, ironed his favorite blue shirt, and picked up a freshly baked red velvet cake from Miller's Bakery, the one Emily had loved since she was a teenager. The cake cost $80, more than he normally spent on himself in a week, but today was special. "My little girl is turning 35, he murmured to himself as he placed the cake carefully on the back seat. When he finally pulled into Emily's quiet suburban street, rows of newly built houses stood under the pale light. He parked in front of the 2-story, 2,000-square-foot home that he had helped her and her husband secure years ago, contributing $60,000 from his retirement savings for the down payment. As he stepped out of his old Buick, he rehearsed what he might say, "Happy birthday, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." Carrying the big white box with the bakery's red logo, he walked up the concrete steps. His heart beat faster than usual. He pressed the doorbell. Footsteps. The door opened. Emily stood there in a fitted sweater, holding her phone. She didn't smile. "Oh, Dad," she said flatly, glancing over her shoulder toward the living room. "Come in." Michael's face brightened with a hopeful grin. "Bo den roi day," he said softly, switching to the Vietnamese phrase he used when she was little, even though they had always spoken English at home. He held out the cake box like an offering. She stepped aside without touching it. Inside, the house smelled faintly of candles and reheated takeout. The television blared a reality show. A couple of Emily's friends were scrolling on their phones on the couch. No one looked up. The same walls Michael had helped paint during construction now felt foreign, like they belonged to strangers. He set the cake on the granite counter and cleared his throat. "Happy birthday, Em. I thought we could all share this later." She glanced at it briefly. "Thanks," she muttered, already turning back to her phone. Michael sat down at the edge of a bar stool, folding his hands together. He had been retired from GM for 3 years now, living modestly on his pension, stretching every dollar. In his mind, this birthday had been a chance to reconnect, maybe laugh over old memories. But the room felt like a waiting room at a clinic, cold, sterile, and full of distractions. As the TV roared in the background, he watched his daughter chatting with her friends, his chest tightening. When did I become an outsider in her life? He wondered. He forced a smile, but his eyes betrayed a sadness he couldn't hide. The celebration he pictured, hugs, laughter, the taste of red velvet frosting, was nowhere to be found. Instead, he sat quietly, a guest in a house built on his sacrifices, feeling like the party had been replaced by a funeral no one wanted to acknowledge. The room seemed to shrink the moment Emily set the wine glasses on the counter. She moved with the practiced ease of someone who had hosted dozens of small gatherings, a tilt of the wrist, the soft clink of glass, but there was no warmth in her movements. Michael watched her from the bar stool, the bakery box open beside him, the red velvet scarlet crumbs glinting under the kitchen light. He had taken off his coat and folded it over his arm, hands trembling not from the chill but from a nervous anticipation he couldn't shake. Emily poured the wine, a cheap Merlot, nothing fancy, and handed him a glass. "Here, Dad," she said, her voice flat. Her eyes met his with a calm bluntness that made his stomach drop. She didn't smile. She didn't touch his hand. "Do you know what my biggest birthday present would be?" she asked suddenly, as if she'd been thinking about it all evening and had to say it out loud. Michael blinked, surprised at the question but buoyed by the hope that it would be something tender, perhaps a confession of gratitude. He smiled, slow and fatherly. "What's that, Em?" he answered, leaning a little forward. He tried to keep his tone light, to bridge whatever distance had crept between them. The words that followed landed like a brick. Emily's mouth was calm, almost clinical. "If you just died," she said. The room, the TV, even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to pause. Michael's fork froze halfway to his mouth. The wineglass in his hand trembled and a bead of Merlot slid down the side, a tiny, dark comet. "What did you say?" He felt the world narrow to the space between their faces. For a second he thought he'd misheard, that maybe exhaustion or the soft lighting had altered his perception. She repeated it, without flinch, as if rehearsed. "I said, if you died. That would be the best gift. You always call, you show up without warning, Dad. I'm exhausted." Her voice was steady, and there was a sharpness in it that Michael had never heard before, not even when they'd argued about money or curfews when she was a teenager. Pain shot through him in 1,000 small ways, a coldness behind his chest, the metallic tang of bile in his throat, the sudden weight of every dollar he had ever given, every plate he had scrubbed, every night shift worked overtime. He looked at the cake. The candles were beginning to slump, the wax had run into tiny rivulets on the paper doily. The image of Emily at 7 years old, cheeks sticky with frosting, singing happy birthday with flour-dusted hair, flickered in his mind, fragile and impossible to reconcile with the woman before him. "Emily," his voice came out ragged. He felt foolish, like a man eavesdropping on a conversation he didn't belong to. "Why would you say that?" I came all this way." She set her glass down with a soft clack. "You don't get it, Dad. You can't respect boundaries. You call when I'm at work, you show up when I have plans, you leave notes in my car. It's suffocating." There was an edge that betrayed a deeper exhaustion, not just annoyance but an accumulation of small grievances stacked high over the years. Michael's fingers dug into his palm to steady himself. Memory after memory rose like photographs, the hospital lobby at midnight when he'd waited while she had a fever, the cramped dorm room where he'd moved furniture in a blizzard, the signed checks to pay off credit card debt after a bad semester. Each memory felt newly traded, currency spent on a child who, in this moment, called him an obstacle. "I didn't mean to suffocate you," he whispered. "I only wanted to help. I only wanted." "To be needed," Emily interrupted bluntly. "Exactly. You like being needed. That's not help. That's control." Her words were not cruel for the sake of cruelty, they were the blunt instrument of someone who had finally named what had hollowed her out. Michael stared at her, at the woman who had once fit in his lap, who had learned to tie her shoes on the porch steps of this very street. The truth of her words felt like a verdict he had not expected. In the hush that followed, he realized the room was not just cold, it had become a place where he was measured, examined, and found wanting. Rain drummed steadily on the windshield as Michael's old Buick hummed along I-70 back toward Dayton. The sky was the same heavy gray as his thoughts, and the wipers squeaked rhythmically, pushing away sheets of water that blurred the taillights ahead. He had been on the road for 40 minutes already, but it felt like he'd been driving for hours, the silence inside the car broken only by the faint hiss of the heater. His hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, knuckles pale. Every few minutes he'd clear his throat, though there was no one to hear him. The words Emily had said replayed in his mind like a broken tape, "If you just died," over and over, they crashed against him. He turned the radio on, then off again. Even music felt like an intrusion. Somewhere near Springfield, he loosened his tie with one hand and sighed. "I spent my whole life," he whispered, eyes fixed on the wet pavement. "My whole life," the images came unbidden, not as numbers, but as moments etched into his body. He saw himself at 38, working double shifts at the GM plant, grease under his nails, saving every extra dollar for Emily's heart surgery at 16, $20,000 gone in a week, but worth it, because it had saved her. He remembered sitting by her hospital bed, her fingers curled around his, whispering, "I love you, Dad," with an oxygen tube in her nose. Then came her college years at Ohio State University, $48,000 in tuition and fees, spread over 4 years. He'd mailed every check with pride, even when it meant skipping meals or selling his old Harley. He'd driven her to campus on move-in day in this very car, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs, joking about how she'd rule the world someday. He thought of her wedding, $30,000. He could still see the white tent in the park, the string lights, Emily's eyes shining as she walked down the aisle. "Thank you for everything, Dad," she had whispered then. He choked back tears, thinking the sacrifices had been worth it. Then the smaller rescues, $15,000 to clear her credit card debt after she lost her first job. $80,000 to renovate the house she now lived in, new roof, new kitchen, all so she could have a place worthy of raising a family. Each figure wasn't just money. It was overtime hours. Missed vacations. A back that ached when he bent to tie his shoes. And now, in the dim glow of the dashboard, all of it lined up like a ledger in his mind. More than $300,000, the bulk of his career and retirement. All traded for a single sentence, "If you just died." Michael swallowed hard, blinking at the blurry reflection of his own face in the rearview mirror. "Was I a fool?" he asked the empty car. His voice cracked. The rain outside thickened, hiding the tears that spilled down his cheeks. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, but new ones came. In that moment, under the weight of Ohio's endless highway and the low clouds pressing down, he felt not just sadness but a hollowness, like a building whose foundation had been quietly stolen over decades. He slowed as a truck splashed past, the roar of water momentarily drowning his thoughts. "You gave her everything," he murmured to himself. "And she told you to disappear." The words hung heavy in the warm car, heavier than the rain. He exhaled, long and shaky, gripping the wheel tighter. For the first time in years, Michael Turner felt like a man untethered, driving through a storm that mirrored exactly what was happening inside him. That night, Michael sat alone at his small kitchen table in Dayton, the rain still dripping from his coat onto the linoleum floor. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. His hands hovered over his cell phone for a long time before he finally pressed call on Emily's number. The screen glowed in the dim light. The dial tone felt like an eternity. He stared at the framed photo of Emily at her college graduation hanging above the table, her arms around him, both of them smiling. Was that really only a few years ago? He wondered. His thumb trembled against the phone as it rang. Finally, a click. "Hello?" Emily's voice was sharp, clipped, like she had been expecting him. Michael swallowed hard. "Emily," he said softly, his voice shaky. "I just need to know, did you mean what you said tonight?" On the other end, a sigh. "Dad, I told you already." "You don't listen. You call all the time. You drop by. You leave things on my porch without asking. It's too much. You're smothering me." Her words landed like small stones. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. So when you said," he hesitated, forcing the words out, "when you said you wanted me gone, you weren't joking?" "I just want you to leave me alone," she said, her tone flat. "I need space." "You're obsessed. You don't get it." For a moment, Michael stared at the raindrops racing down the dark window. The phone felt heavier than it should. The old ache behind his ribs started again, but instead of tears, he felt a strange stillness. His eyes were dry now. "All right," he said at last, his voice low but steady. "You want me to disappear? I'll disappear. But not the way you think." On the other end, silence. "Dad," she began, but he had already pressed end call. The screen went black. He sat there for a long while, listening to the clock tick on the wall. His heart was pounding but his breathing was even. In the quiet of his kitchen, something shifted. The humiliation of the evening, the decades of sacrifices, the hurtful words, all of it settled into a kind of clarity he hadn't known he possessed. He rose from the chair slowly, walked to the sink, and poured himself a glass of water. His hands no longer shook. In the hallway mirror, he caught his reflection, a man with tired eyes but a firmer jaw than before. Enough, he whispered to himself. No more. He sat back down, took out a yellow notepad, and began to write. Not a letter yet, just a list of what was his, what he had given, what he could reclaim. With each line, he felt something in his chest unclench. In that quiet, a new Michael Turner was forming, not the father who always showed up with his wallet open, not the man who absorbed every slight in the name of love, but someone who would act. Someone who would set boundaries. He wasn't sure yet what that meant exactly, but he knew it started now. Outside, the rain slowed to a mist. The clock ticked on. In the small kitchen in Dayton, a man who had been broken only hours earlier began, quietly, to rebuild himself. The next morning dawned cold and pale over Dayton. Michael woke before sunrise, as he had done for decades when he still worked at the GM plant. The old habit of rising early made him feel purposeful again. He showered, shaved carefully, and ironed his blue button-down shirt, the one he used to wear on important days. Today, he told himself, was an important day. He brewed a pot of black coffee and sat at his small kitchen table, the same place where, only hours before, he had decided to change his life. The steam curled up into the cool air. He opened his worn leather wallet and checked the bank card he had kept for years, the one tied to the joint emergency account he'd opened for Emily. $25,000, he thought, running his thumb over the embossed numbers. Money he had always imagined as a safety net for her, braces for the grandchildren, unexpected car repairs, a medical bill. But now he saw it differently. It was the symbol of a lifetime of automatic giving, and today he was going to take it back. By 8:30 a.m., Michael was standing inside the Chase Bank branch on Main Street. The lobby smelled faintly of paper and carpet cleaner. A young teller in a gray blazer smiled politely. Good morning, sir. How can I help you today? Michael cleared his throat. I'm here to close a joint account. Number ending in 4195. His voice was calm but firm. He handed over his ID, the card, and the small stack of documents he had gathered. The teller typed on the keyboard, glancing up. This is a joint account with an Emily Turner, correct? Yes, Michael said. He felt his heart thump. Please transfer all remaining funds to my personal account. There was a pause, then the teller nodded. Of course. I just need your signature here and here. She slid the forms across the counter. Michael took the pen. His hand hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then he pressed the ballpoint down. One signature. Another. He slid the papers back. The teller clicked a few more keys. All set. The funds have been moved. The joint account is now closed. Michael exhaled. It felt like he had just cut an invisible rope he'd been tied to for years. Thank you, he said quietly, tucking the receipt into his wallet. Outside, the winter sun was brighter than before. He buttoned his coat and walked 3 blocks to the brick building that housed the law office of Sandra Whitaker, the attorney who had helped him when he retired. Her office smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper. Sandra, a tall woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair, shook his hand warmly. Michael, good to see you. What brings you in? He sat down across from her mahogany desk. I need to review the co-signed mortgage and deed on my daughter Emily's house, he said. I need to know my rights. Sandra opened a file folder, scanning the papers. You're listed as co-owner and guarantor. That means you can withdraw your ownership interest or initiate proceedings to reclaim your share if obligations aren't met. She looked at him kindly. You've been more than generous, Michael. You don't have to keep carrying this. He nodded, staring at the legal text. I think it's time I stopped, he said, his voice low but steady. She passed him a pen. If you're ready, you can sign here to begin the process. It won't be immediate, but it will protect your interests. Michael took the pen. He could hear the faint hum of a printer, the muted ring of a phone in the next room. He thought about Emily's words, "if you just died," and felt the weight of them turn into something else, resolve. One signature, then another. He straightened his back. When he was finished, Sandra gathered the documents. "It's done," she said. "From here on, you're protected. You've taken back control." Michael stood, buttoning his coat. "Thank you," he said. As he walked out into the brisk Ohio morning, he felt a strange, light sensation in his chest, as if someone had unlatched a cage. He was no longer just the weak father who gave and gave. With every signature he had retrieved not just his money, but his freedom and the self-respect he had been losing for years. The first step back to himself had been taken. That same afternoon, after leaving the bank and walking out into the crisp Ohio air, Michael felt the weight of a decision pressing on him. He drove his old silver Ford Taurus down Main Street toward Sandra Whitaker's law office, the same brick building where, years ago, he had signed retirement papers with trembling hands. The windshield wipers squeaked as they swept away a thin drizzle. He parked carefully, sat for a moment with the engine off, and stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His eyes were red but resolute. "It's time," he whispered to himself. Inside, the reception area smelled faintly of coffee and lemon-scented polish. A young assistant with dark hair greeted him. "Mr. Turner, Ms. Whitaker will see you now," she said, offering a small smile. Sandra's office was warm and lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes. A diploma from Ohio State University hung above her desk. She rose from her chair and shook Michael's hand. "Back again so soon," she said gently. "How are you holding up?" Michael lowered himself into the chair across from her, placing a thick envelope on the desk. "I'm steady," he said after a pause. "And I need to change my will." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "All right. Tell me what you have in mind." He took a deep breath. "I have about $350,000 in savings and investments. Plus a life insurance policy worth $120,000. I want it all to go to the local Veterans Foundation and a scholarship for underprivileged technical students." He paused, looking down at his hands. "No more Emily." Sandra tilted her head, her pen hovering above the pad. "Not even a portion?" "I'll set up a trust fund for my 2 grandchildren," Michael said firmly. "But they can't touch it until they're at least 25. They need to learn to stand on their own feet." For a moment Sandra studied him. "You're sure about this?" "It's a major change, Michael. Once it's filed, it's binding." He met her gaze squarely. "I've never been sure of anything." His voice was low but steady, like a man reading a verdict to himself. Sandra nodded slowly. "Then let's do it." She opened a new file and began typing, the soft clack of the keyboard filling the room. She explained each clause in plain language, pausing for him to initial each page. Michael listened carefully, asked a few questions, and signed. Each stroke of his pen felt like a release of years of resentment and quiet pain. As he signed the last page, he looked up. "This isn't revenge," he said, almost to himself. "This is me saying love isn't a blank check. It's not automatic. It's not to be taken for granted." Sandra gave a small nod. "It's also you taking care of people who will value it," she said. Michael exhaled slowly. He felt an unexpected calm wash over him, like the quiet after a storm. For the first time in decades, his future, and the legacy of his life's work, belonged entirely to his own choice. He gathered his coat and stood. "Thank you, Sandra," he said. "For helping me do this." "Of course, Michael," she replied. "You're doing the right thing." As he walked out into the fading afternoon light, the drizzle had stopped. The air smelled of wet pavement and leaves. Michael looked up at the sky and felt something inside shift. He wasn't trying to punish his daughter, he was leaving a message she might one day understand: love is a gift, not a guarantee. and he was finally free to decide what to do with his own. That evening, Michael sat on his back porch in Dayton, the late winter air biting at his cheeks. The neighborhood was quiet except for the distant hum of a lawnmower and the soft creak of his rocking chair. He cradled a mug of coffee between his palms, its warmth seeping into his fingers. Across the narrow chain-link fence, Robert Hayes, his neighbor of 15 years and closest friend, was tinkering with an old lawnmower engine in his garage. Michael called out softly, "Rob, you got a minute?" Robert wiped his hands on a rag and walked over, still in his faded Marine Corps sweatshirt. At 70, his back was straight and his eyes sharp, the look of a man who had seen things most people only read about. "Sure, Mike. What's on your mind?" he asked, leaning against the porch railing. Michael stared into his coffee. "I've decided to disappear for a while," he said at last. Not like dying. But gone. I want Emily to feel what it's like not to have me there, not to have my money, my calls, my help." Robert raised his eyebrows but didn't look surprised. He'd been watching the slow unraveling of Michael's relationship with his daughter for years. "You've carried her for too long, buddy," he said quietly. "You deserve your freedom." Michael gave a sad laugh. "You think it'll matter to her?" Robert's eyes softened. "It might not right away. But eventually? She'll know what she lost. And even if she doesn't, you'll be free." He put a hand on Michael's shoulder. "You've done your duty, Mike. Now it's time to do right by yourself." Michael nodded, his throat tight. "I'm not trying to be cruel. I can't live like this anymore." He went inside after Robert left, the old floorboards creaking under his weight. In his small, dimly lit study, he pulled out a stack of lined paper and his favorite black pen. He sat at the desk where he had once filled out Emily's college financial aid forms, and began to write. The first words came haltingly, then in a flood. "Dear Emily, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not dead. Just gone. For 70 years I've been a father who gave and gave, but somewhere along the way, I lost myself." For hours, the pen scratched across the pages. He listed every sacrifice: the heart surgery at 16, the tuition, the wedding, the down payment, the credit card debt, the renovations. He explained the legal changes he had made, the joint account closed, the co-ownership withdrawn, the will rewritten. He wrote it all without bitterness, his words calm and deliberate, like a ledger of love. When he reached page 15, he signed his name. Michael Turner. He read it over once, twice, then folded the pages neatly and slipped them into a large envelope. On the front he wrote, "For Emily." He imagined her finding it on the kitchen table, imagined her reading each line slowly, the dawning realization of what his life had been and what he had done for her. It wasn't meant to hurt her. It was meant to teach her. A delayed lesson. A slow-burning fuse. He placed the envelope into his worn leather briefcase, along with his passport and travel documents. Tomorrow, he would leave it on her dining room table before he drove to the airport. As he zipped the case shut, he whispered to the empty room, "This isn't vengeance. It's my way of saying goodbye, and my way of saying enough." Outside, the streetlights flickered on. In the silence of his little house, Michael felt a strange calm settle over him. He wasn't just planning an escape. He was writing the first chapter of a new life, one where he was no longer a victim, but a man finally choosing himself. Early the next morning, Dayton was still wrapped in a soft gray mist when Michael Turner closed the door to his little brick house for the last time. The hinges creaked faintly as he pulled it shut. In his worn leather satchel lay a carefully counted stack of cash, $20,000 he had withdrawn from his savings the previous day, along with his passport, a few shirts, and a folded list of places he wanted to see. For decades he had packed for others, field trips, weddings, emergencies. Today he packed only for himself. He drove his old Ford Taurus to the Dayton International Airport, the road slick from overnight rain. The windshield wipers squeaked in a steady rhythm, like a drumbeat pushing him forward. As he pulled into the long-term parking lot, he sat for a moment with the engine off, staring at his hands on the steering wheel. They were calloused and lined, the hands of a man who had spent years turning wrenches and signing checks. "This is it, Mike," he murmured aloud. "No turning back now." Inside the terminal, he moved slowly through security with a single carry-on bag. The TSA agent glanced at his ID, then at him. "Heading somewhere warm?" she asked with a polite smile. Michael nodded. "California," he said softly. "First time going for myself." At gate B12 he sat by the window, watching planes taxi on the wet tarmac. He thought about Emily waking up to the envelope on her table, about the shock and maybe anger she would feel reading it. He closed his eyes and took a long breath. This wasn't revenge. This was rebirth. When his boarding group was called, he rose, handed over his ticket, and stepped onto the jet bridge. The warm, recycled air of the plane hit him as he entered. He found his seat by the window, stowed his bag in the overhead compartment, and settled in. As the engines began to roar and the plane started to taxi, he pressed his palm against the cold glass. A young woman with a laptop in the next seat glanced at him and smiled. "Business or pleasure?" she asked. Michael gave a small, almost shy grin. "Neither." "Starting over," he said. "At my age, I guess you could call it freedom." She chuckled softly. "Good for you." As the plane lifted off the runway, the Ohio fields grew smaller beneath him until they blurred into patches of brown and green. Clouds enveloped the plane, and then, suddenly, there was blue sky. Michael felt his heart beat faster, not from fear but from something like joy. Hours later, as the aircraft began its descent, he glimpsed the Pacific Ocean for the first time in years, a vast sheet of silver under the California sun. He leaned closer to the window, his breath fogging the glass. "Never too late," he whispered to himself, almost in awe. Never too late. When the wheels touched down at San Diego International Airport, he felt a tremor of excitement run through him. This wasn't just a trip. It was a line drawn between two lives, the man who had spent decades sacrificing himself and the man now daring to live for his own dreams. As he stepped off the plane into the bright California afternoon, the smell of salt air drifted faintly through the terminal doors. For the first time in decades, Michael Turner walked into a future that belonged entirely to him. On a sun-splashed morning in San Diego, Michael sat at a small table on the patio of a cafe in Ocean Beach, just a block from the Pacific. The smell of salt water and roasted coffee beans drifted in the breeze. He had ordered a simple breakfast, scrambled eggs, sourdough toast, and a mug of strong coffee, but to him it felt like a feast. For the first time in decades, he was eating a meal without glancing at his phone, worrying about who might need him. The surf boomed softly in the distance, gulls circling overhead. He looked out toward the glittering ocean and breathed deeply. This is what freedom tastes like, he thought. Back in Columbus, the Turner household was a very different scene. Emily had woken up to find the thick envelope sitting squarely on her kitchen table, her father's familiar handwriting on the front, for Emily. She had ripped it open, pages spilling onto the hardwood floor. 15 sheets covered in Michael's careful script, sacrifices, bank accounts closed, legal rights withdrawn. By the time she reached the last page, her hands were shaking. Her phone buzzed constantly as she paced the living room. She fired off one text after another, her thumbs flying. "Dad, where are you? This isn't funny." Another, "Dad, pick up. Please. We need to talk." A third, "Dad, are you okay?" The dots on the screen pulsed and then went still. Miles away, Michael's phone vibrated once on the cafe table. He glanced at the screen, 27 unread messages, all from Emily. He hesitated, took a sip of coffee, then typed slowly, "I'm fine. Don't look for me." He hit send and set the phone face down. Across the country, Emily's heart pounded as the single reply appeared. She hit call immediately. "Dad," she said when the line clicked. "You can't just disappear. You don't understand what you're doing." The lawyer says you can take the house from us. Her voice cracked on the last word. Michael's fork hovered above his plate. He picked up the phone and brought it to his ear. His tone was calm, almost gentle. "Emily," he said, "do you need me, or do you need my money?" There was a long silence on the line. In Columbus, Emily stared at the kitchen counter, the papers scattered like snow. She opened her mouth but nothing came out. Michael waited, listening to the quiet hiss of the ocean and the faint static on the call. The power dynamic had shifted without fanfare. For the first time, he was not the one begging, apologizing, or explaining. I'll call you back," Emily whispered at last and hung up. Michael set the phone down, exhaling slowly. The eggs on his plate had gone cold, but he didn't mind. He watched a surfer catch a wave, rising and falling with the water, and felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't punishing her. He was simply standing up. The cafe's waitress, a young woman with a nose ring, refilled his coffee. "You're visiting?" she asked brightly. Michael smiled faintly. "Something like that," he said. As the morning sun climbed higher over Ocean Beach, Michael Turner sipped his coffee and looked out at the horizon. In Columbus, Emily was staring at her phone, confronted for the first time with a question she couldn't answer. And somewhere between the two coasts, a lifetime of imbalance was quietly, irrevocably shifting. That evening, Michael found himself at a small seafood restaurant tucked away on Newport Avenue in Ocean Beach. The wooden sign above the door read Pier 49 Grill in faded blue paint. Inside, the smell of grilled fish and garlic butter mingled with the salt air that drifted through the open windows. Surfboards lined the walls, and a live guitarist strummed softly in the corner. It was the kind of place he had walked past dozens of times when traveling for work, never once thinking to stop for himself. He chose a table by the window overlooking the street, where people strolled past with ice creams and dogs on leashes. A waitress with a sunny smile brought him a menu. "Evening, hon, first time here?" she asked. Michael smiled, a little shy but relaxed. "First time doing a lot of things," he said. "I'll take the grilled sea bass, please. And a glass of white wine." "Good choice," she said, jotting it down. "It's our special tonight. $25. In the past, Michael would have hesitated, mentally calculating how many groceries that could buy, how many bills it could cover for Emily. He had lived decades in parent mode, where every dollar was a lifeline for someone else. Tonight, he didn't flinch. When the plate arrived, a generous fillet of sea bass with lemon and herbs, a side of roasted vegetables, he breathed in the scent like a man smelling freedom. He cut into the fish slowly, savoring each bite. The wine was crisp and cool against his tongue. Outside, the sky burned orange and purple as the sun slid into the Pacific. He found himself whispering aloud, "I don't have to ask permission for this. Not anymore." His phone buzzed once on the table. Emily again. He turned it face down without opening it. The guitarist shifted into a slow, wistful tune, and Michael let the music wash over him. For the first time in years, there was no guilt in his meal, no rush to finish and drive somewhere, no mental checklist of favors owed. Just himself, his food, the soft hum of a California evening. The waitress returned to ask if he needed anything else. He shook his head, smiling. "No, thank you. This is perfect." As he sipped the last of his wine, Michael felt a quiet realization settle over him. Happiness wasn't something anyone could grant him, not even his own daughter. It wasn't a prize for good behavior or a gift handed down. It was something to claim, to build, to protect. All these years he had thought selflessness was love, but now he saw how easily it could become servitude. "This isn't revenge," he murmured under his breath, tracing the rim of his glass. "This is rebirth." The word felt strange but right. He paid the bill without hesitation, leaving a generous tip. As he stepped out into the cool night, the ocean's roar filled his ears. People laughed, cars rolled past, a dog barked at a skateboarder. Life was happening all around him, and for the first time in decades, he felt part of it. He walked down to the beach and stood at the edge of the water, his shoes sinking slightly into the wet sand. The waves hissed and curled at his feet. Above him, the stars blinked faintly. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the past fall away with each exhale. He thought of Emily, not with anger, but with a distant sadness. Maybe one day she would understand. Maybe not. Either way, he was finally learning to live for himself. And as the tide rolled in, Michael Turner whispered his new mantra into the ocean air. It's never too late. 3 days after arriving in San Diego, Michael was sitting by the window of his small rented apartment above a surf shop in Ocean Beach. The apartment wasn't fancy, a single bedroom, a kitchenette with chip tiles, a balcony with 2 plastic chairs, but it smelled of salt air and freedom. He had just finished brewing a pot of coffee when his phone began vibrating across the counter like a trapped insect. At first, he ignored it. But the vibrations didn't stop. When he finally glanced at the screen, the number stunned him: 53 missed calls. 28 new messages. Almost all from Emily. A few from unknown numbers he assumed were David's friends. The phone buzzed again in his hand. He pressed it to silence and poured his coffee, but curiosity got the better of him. He sat down by the window and began to scroll. The first text read, "Dad, please answer. We're so worried. We've already called the police. They said you disappeared without a trace." Another followed moments later. "The Columbus police told us there's nothing they can do because you're an adult and you left a letter. How could you do this to us?" Michael stared at the words. His thumb hovered over the keyboard, but he said nothing yet. Outside the window, surfers were walking to the beach with boards under their arms, and a street musician was setting up his guitar on the sidewalk. Life went on. Then Emily's tone shifted. The bank called. "Dad, you closed the joint account. How are we supposed to handle emergencies now? You know David lost his job again. We're drowning here." Michael felt a strange calm wash over him. He read each message slowly, the way a detective reads evidence. There was no mention of his safety, his health, his state of mind. Only panic over the missing money. He leaned back in his chair and let out a soft, bitter laugh. "So that's what you're really scared of," he whispered. His phone buzzed again, this time a call. Emily's name filled the screen. He let it ring 3 times before answering. "Dad." Her voice was high, almost a scream. "Where are you? You're ruining our lives." Michael's voice was steady. "Emily," he said quietly, "I'm fine. I'm exactly where I need to be. Don't look for me." "You don't understand," she cried. "The mortgage lawyer says you can take our house. Do you want us homeless? Are you trying to destroy us?" Michael walked to the window, looking out at the bright California sky. His reflection in the glass didn't look like a broken old man anymore. "Emily," he said softly, "do you need your father, or do you need his money?" There was a beat of silence on the line. Only her breathing, quick and shallow. Then the call disconnected. Michael stood there for a long moment, the phone cooling in his hand. He set it down on the counter, next to his coffee, and stepped out onto the balcony. The Pacific stretched blue and endless before him, gulls diving in the breeze. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel trapped by guilt or duty. He felt light. He took a sip of coffee and allowed himself a small, wry smile. "I'm not ruining you, Emily," he murmured to the ocean air. "I'm freeing myself." The words sounded foreign and beautiful, like a new language he was just beginning to speak. Down below, the street musician began to play a slow, soulful tune. Michael leaned against the balcony railing, listening. Behind him, his phone buzzed again, more messages, more missed calls, but he didn't pick it up. For the first time, he realized he didn't have to. That afternoon, the sun was warm and golden over La Jolla. Michael drove his rented silver Corolla along the winding coastline, passing surfers and families eating ice cream. The Pacific shimmered like glass under the California sky. He parked near a Spanish-style office building with white stucco walls and red-tiled roofs. The sign read, Mills Retirement and Wealth Planning. He smoothed the front of his light blue shirt and took a deep breath before stepping inside. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and eucalyptus. A receptionist with short gray hair greeted him with a smile. "Mr. Turner? Ms. Mills will see you now." Karen Mills, 62, stood to shake his hand as he entered her office. She was tall and elegant, with a soft southern accent and a stack of colorful files on her desk. "Welcome to La Jolla, Mr. Turner. I read a bit of your case from the email you sent. Please, have a seat." Michael sat opposite her, hands clasped tightly in his lap. He had been a mechanical engineer for 40 years but had never once felt comfortable talking about money, at least not about his money. This felt like stepping into a new world. Karen opened a navy folder and adjusted her glasses. "All right," she said, her tone both businesslike and kind. "You currently have $310,000 in savings after all recent changes, plus your monthly pension of $2,500. Here in California, if managed wisely, that's more than enough to live comfortably." Michael exhaled a long, shaky breath. I've never heard anyone say that to me before. It's always been about what I can give, not what I can live on." Karen smiled. "Well, we're going to change that. This meeting is about you. Not your daughter, not anyone else. You." Her words struck him like a quiet bell. Michael leaned back and looked out the window at a stand of palm trees swaying in the ocean breeze. For the first time, he wasn't calculating how much Emily's emergencies would cost, or whether he should send another check. He was thinking about himself. Karen flipped to another page. "I'd suggest placing a good portion of your savings into a West Coast real estate investment trust," she said, sliding a brochure across the desk. "It's stable, diversified, and offers steady returns. In 5 to 7 years, your assets could grow significantly. Meanwhile, you'd have enough liquidity for travel, hobbies, or whatever life you want to build here." Michael picked up the brochure, running his thumb over the glossy photos of apartment buildings and townhouses. He chuckled softly. "You know," he said, "I should have done something like this 10 years ago. But I was too busy helping." Karen tilted her head sympathetically. "It's never too late, Mr. Turner. Sometimes life gives us a second act." Michael met her eyes. "I think this is mine," he said quietly. They spent the next hour reviewing numbers, planning out budgets, even talking about his hobbies. Karen asked what he enjoyed besides work. Michael hesitated, then admitted he'd always wanted to learn photography and maybe travel up the Pacific Coast Highway. She wrote it down as if it were an action item, not a dream. When the meeting ended, Karen extended her hand. "You're not just moving money around," she told him. "You're starting a new chapter. Own it." Michael shook her hand firmly. "Thank you," he said. As he stepped back into the sunlight, the Pacific breeze hit his face. For the first time in years, he felt as though invisible chains had fallen from his wrists. No emergency fund for Emily. No silent guilt. Just his life, his choices, and a future he could finally shape. He walked to his car with a small, incredulous smile. "A new chapter," he whispered to himself. "I guess it's time." It was a bright Saturday morning at Pacific Beach. The sun had just risen over the Loslan pastel houses, casting long golden lines across the sand. The smell of sunscreen mixed with the salty tang of the ocean. Michael parked his rented Corolla near the boardwalk and adjusted the strap of his canvas duffel. Inside were a towel, a change of clothes, and the new shortboard he'd rented for the day. He still couldn't believe he'd signed up for something called Silver Surfers, a program for people over 60 learning to surf. As he approached the group, 12 men and women stood in a loose circle around a tall instructor with sun-bleached hair. Some were stretching, others were laughing nervously. Their boards lay on the sand like giant crayons. "Welcome to Silver Surfers," the instructor called out. "We're here to have fun and maybe catch a wave or two." Michael laid his board down next to a man with a weathered but kind face. "Name's Harold Green," the man said, extending a hand. 70 years old. Used to teach high school history in Tucson. "Michael Turner," Michael replied, shaking it. 68. Mechanical engineer, retired. They both kneeled on their boards to practice paddling. Harold looked over at him. "So, what brings you to surfing at our age?" he asked with a chuckle. Michael hesitated. He'd kept his story mostly to himself since arriving in California, but something about Harold's steady eyes felt safe. "Honestly," he said, lowering his voice. "My daughter told me, on her birthday no less, that the best gift would be if I died." Harold stopped mid-stretch, eyes widening. "You're joking," he said. Michael shook his head slowly. "I wish I was. I raised her alone, paid off her debts, her college, her wedding. Even her mortgage. And now," he looked out at the crashing waves. "Now she sees me as a burden." Harold's face softened with recognition. "I get it," he murmured. "My son and daughter-in-law did the same thing, treated me like a bank with a pulse. Last year I finally cut off the monthly checks. Haven't heard from them since except for angry emails." For a moment, both men were silent, the sound of the ocean filling the space between them. Then Harold let out a low, bitter laugh. "Guess we're not alone, huh?" Michael found himself laughing too, though it was tinged with sadness. "No," he said. "We're not. Seems there's a whole generation of parents out there funding their adult children's lifestyles, calling it love." Nearby, one of the women in the group, a petite lady with silver braids, overheard them. "You guys talking about grown kids?" she asked with a wry smile. "Join the club. I'm here because my daughter only calls when she needs money for her yoga studio." The instructor blew his whistle. "All right, Silver Surfers. Let's hit the water." As Michael and Harold carried their boards toward the surf, Michael felt something shift inside him. The Pacific was cold against his feet, but he didn't mind. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a freak for pulling back, for saying no. He felt part of something bigger, a quiet army of older parents reclaiming their lives wave by wave. Harold nudged him as they paddled out. "We might fall a lot today," he said, "but at least we're falling forward." Michael smiled at the horizon. "Falling forward," he echoed. The phrase felt good in his mouth, like a promise. As he caught his first clumsy wave, saltwater spraying his face, Michael realized he wasn't just learning to surf. He was learning to stand again, not for Emily, but for himself. The late afternoon sun slanted across the sand at Pacific Beach, turning the water into a sheet of hammered gold. After the surf lesson, Michael and Harold sat on a weathered wooden bench near the boardwalk, boards propped up beside them, towels draped over their shoulders. They were both damp and salty, but there was an easy camaraderie between them now, the kind that comes from shared struggle rather than small talk. Harold cracked open a bottle of water and took a long drink. His hands trembled slightly, not from the surf but from something deeper. "You know," he began, voice low, "those first months after I cut my kids off. I thought I was the worst man alive. Selfish. Cold. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. wondering if I'd damned myself." Michael turned to him, surprised. Harold's steady demeanor had fooled him. "You?" Michael asked. "You seem so sure now." Harold gave a sad little smile. "It wasn't always like this. At first, I kept telling myself, they're my children. I owe them. Even when they were 40, 50. I paid their bills, their vacations. I thought it was love. He wiped his forehead with the edge of his towel. Then one day, I realized they had never once asked if I was happy. Not once. They only asked if the check cleared. Michael stared out at the waves, feeling Harold's words land inside him like stones dropped into deep water. He could almost hear Emily's voice echoing in his head, the endless requests, the guilt, the "you're ruining our lives" texts. Not once had she asked if he was okay, if he was lonely, if he was proud of what he'd given up. "That's not love," Harold said quietly, looking straight ahead. "That's extraction. That's taking." Michael's throat tightened. The phrase felt like someone had cleaned the fog off a mirror. He could suddenly see himself, his past, with painful clarity. He whispered, more to himself than to Harold, "You're right. All these years, I thought sacrifice would be rewarded. It was just expected." They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the crash of the surf and the cries of gulls overhead. Children ran past with sand buckets, and a dog barked at the tide. It was an ordinary scene, but for Michael it felt like a curtain had lifted. That night, back in his small Ocean Beach apartment, Michael showered off the salt and sat at the tiny table by the window. The room smelled of soap and sea air. His phone lay on the table, screen dark. He hesitated, then picked it up and pressed the button. 65 missed calls. 42 new messages. He scrolled through them slowly. Every text circled back to the same themes: bank accounts, mortgages, consequences. Not a single "Are you okay, Dad?" Not one word of apology, remorse, or understanding. Just panic about the money gone. Michael felt a strange calm settle over him, like a lake after a storm. He opened a new message, his thumbs steady. He typed slowly, each word deliberate. "I'm happier than I've ever been. This is the natural consequence of your own actions." He stared at the words for a moment, then pressed send. A small whoosh sound. Done. He placed the phone face down on the table and turned it off. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was light, almost buoyant. He leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Outside, the ocean roared faintly under the stars. For the first time in years, Michael felt no tug, no guilt, no invisible chain pulling him back. Just the quiet knowledge that he had finally named the truth, and in naming it, freed himself. He got up, poured himself a glass of water, and stepped out onto the balcony. Down below, a couple walked hand in hand along the sidewalk, laughing softly. Michael rested his arms on the railing and looked up at the night sky. Extraction, he murmured to himself, tasting the word. Not love. Then he closed his eyes and let the sea breeze wash over his face, feeling lighter than he had in decades. The Monday morning light poured gently through the blinds of the small leasing office in Mission Valley, casting warm stripes across the beige carpet. Michael sat across from the property manager, a kind-faced woman named Linda, who held out a clipboard stacked with documents. The smell of fresh coffee from the break room drifted into the space, mixing with the faint scent of new paint. "You're sure about this?" Linda asked softly, glancing at the one-bedroom apartment key lying on the table between them. "It's a big step, moving here permanently." Michael straightened his shoulders. He wore a clean blue polo tucked into khaki pants, and his hands were steady as he picked up the pen. "Yes," he said firmly. "I've never been more sure about anything in my life." His voice was calm, but inside, a quiet thrill pulsed, the sense of a man stepping into his own life for the first time in decades. He signed each page slowly, deliberately, as if carving his signature into a new chapter. When Linda handed him the key, his fingers brushed the cool metal. "Welcome home," she smiled. The apartment itself was modest but bright, a small balcony overlooking a row of palms, a kitchenette with clean counters, and a living room just large enough for a sofa and a desk. Michael walked through the empty space, his footsteps echoing softly on the laminate floor. He opened the sliding door to the balcony, feeling the San Diego breeze rush over him. The scent of the Pacific, salt and sun, filled his lungs. He closed his eyes and thought, this is mine. Just mine. Later that afternoon, sitting at the tiny dining table, Michael called Karen Mills. She had been his lifeline through this financial transition. Karen, he said, go ahead and list the old truck. And please transfer my pension payments to the California bank. Got it, Karen replied warmly over the phone. I'm proud of you, Michael. This is a new start. I think so too, he said quietly, glancing around at the bare walls. It feels strange. But good strange. As the sun began to dip low, his cell phone lit up with Robert Hayes' name. Michael answered, and the familiar voice of his neighbor-turned confidant carried through the speaker. Mike, Robert said, Emily came by Dayton today. She was in tears. Asking everyone if they'd seen you. Michael leaned against the balcony railing, looking out at the palm trees swaying in the breeze. For a moment, a pang of old guilt flickered, the father who always rushed to fix, to soothe. But then he took a slow breath and let it pass. Robert, he said quietly, that man, the father she thinks she can summon, he's gone. He died the day she wished me dead on her birthday. Robert was silent for a beat. You sound different, he finally said. Lighter. I am, Michael answered, surprising himself with how true it felt. I'm not angry. Just done. It's time for her to learn what life without my safety net feels like. He ended the call gently and went back inside. On the wall above his bed, he had hung a framed photograph of the Pacific Ocean he'd bought from a street vendor at Ocean Beach. The waves in the picture rolled toward the viewer, endless and blue, sunlight dancing on the surface. Michael stood looking at it for a long moment. It wasn't just decoration. It was a reminder, a quiet promise to himself. Freedom wasn't a reward someone handed you, it was a choice you made, one signature, one step at a time. He sat down on the edge of the bed, the evening breeze fluttering the curtains, and whispered under his breath, "This is my life now." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a steady peace. For the first time in years, he felt he could actually exhale. The past wasn't erased, but it no longer owned him. In this small, sunlit apartment, Michael Turner was closing one door and opening another, a door not into exile but into freedom. 3 weeks slipped by in a way Michael hadn't felt in decades. His days were no longer built around crisis calls or emergency wire transfers. Instead, they had a gentle rhythm of his own making. Each Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning, he walked down to the community center in Mission Valley for his beginner Spanish class. The teacher, a cheerful woman named Marisol, always greeted him at the door with "Buenos dias, Miguel," and a high five. At first he had blushed, fumbling the words, but now he could already form small sentences, enough to order coffee or chat with his new neighbors. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, he rolled out a thin blue mat on the sand at Ocean Beach and joined a group of retirees for sunrise yoga. The smell of salt and coconut oil filled the air. Seagulls squawked overhead. The instructor guided them through slow stretches as the Pacific shimmered under the first light. Michael found his stiff shoulders softening, his breathing deeper. This is what morning should feel like, he thought one day, lying on his back in Shavasana, the sky wide above him. Evenings often ended at a small cafe where the local book club met to discuss American novels. On his first night, the group had debated Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. A retired librarian named Joyce had asked him, "So, Michael, did you see yourself in any of the characters?" He'd smiled wryly. Maybe in the father who keeps trying to hold his family together, even as they keep moving on. The group had nodded knowingly, and for once he didn't feel like an outsider. The biggest surprise wasn't the social life, though. It was his bank account. Karen Mills, his advisor, had moved his savings into a West Coast real estate fund. Instead of draining, it was growing. Every Friday she sent a neat little report to his email. "You're up 4% this month," she wrote in one. "See what happens when you invest in yourself?" Michael would stare at the numbers with a mixture of relief and regret. "Why didn't I do this 10 years ago?" he muttered one afternoon, sipping iced tea on his balcony. One bright morning, he sat at the same balcony table, wearing an old Ohio State t-shirt, eating peanut butter on whole wheat toast. His small radio played soft jazz. A mug of coffee steamed beside him. He felt light, almost young, watching the palm trees sway. Then his phone buzzed, flashing a number from Washington, D.C. He frowned and answered. "Hello? Mr. Turner?" A crisp female voice. "This is Linda Brown from the Social Services Department. Your daughter Emily has contacted us. She's reported concerns that you may be suffering from cognitive decline and living in poor conditions abroad." Michael froze, toast halfway to his mouth. His stomach clenched. Abroad? He thought bitterly. So this is her next move, paint me as incompetent to regain control. He set the toast down carefully and steadied his voice. "I'm perfectly lucid, Ms. Brown. I'm not abroad, I'm in California. I live independently, by choice. If you'd like to verify that, you're welcome to come." There was a pause on the line, then Linda's tone softened. "You sound clear and composed, sir. This isn't what I expected. We'll coordinate with the local consulate if an evaluation is needed." "That's fine," Michael said evenly. "I have nothing to hide." He ended the call and sat back in his chair. For a moment his hands trembled, then he picked up his mug and took a slow sip. The coffee was still warm. Out on the street a child rode by on a scooter, laughing. Michael felt a small smile creep across his face. "Nice try, Emily," he murmured under his breath. "But I'm not the man you can control anymore." The breeze ruffled the edge of his newspaper, and he reached to hold it down. He realized he wasn't angry, just oddly calm, like a man who's been accused of being lost but knows exactly where he is. The call from the social worker had barely ended when Michael pushed his coffee mug aside and reached for his worn leather notebook. The morning light poured across his little balcony, but his hands were already moving with a quiet steadiness, flipping to a page marked legal. He had been keeping careful notes since he left Ohio, dates, names, copies of every email. Now those notes were about to matter. He scrolled through his phone contacts and pressed Sandra Lewis, his attorney back in Columbus. She had been with him through the will change and the house title issues. It took only 2 rings before her calm, husky voice came through. "Michael? Everything okay?" Michael exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Emily's at it again, Sandra. She's telling social services that I'm suffering from dementia, living in terrible conditions. She's also trying to contest the will. I just got a call from a woman named Linda Brown in D.C. On the other end of the line, Sandra let out a long sigh. "I was afraid of this. She's retained a young attorney in Columbus who's filing motions to block your access to the house equity and request a court review of your mental competency." Michael felt the sting of those words but kept his voice level. "She's trying to paint me as incompetent." "Yes," Sandra said, "but she has no ground to stand on. We have your medical evaluations, the recordings of her birthday comments, the documents showing your voluntary transfers. You're lucid. You're in control." He stood up and began pacing the small living room, his bare feet whispering across the tile. Out the window the palms bent in the breeze, but inside his chest, a different wind was blowing, a wind of resolve. "I don't want to hate her," he said quietly into the phone, "but she can't keep doing this without consequence. I raised her. I gave her everything. She has to learn accountability." There was a pause, then Sandra's voice softened but gained steel. "Michael, this isn't about hate. It's about boundaries and the law. You have the right to protect yourself." He stopped pacing and stared at the photograph of the Pacific Ocean on his wall, the waves frozen mid-crest. "Prepare the paperwork," he said. "Defamation. False reports to social services. Whatever we can file. I'm not doing this to punish her. I'm doing this to defend my name." Sandra almost smiled through the line, he could hear it in her tone. "I've been waiting for you to say that." It's time she faced legal consequences. I'll draft the suit and send it for your signature. Michael lowered himself into the chair, his shoulders no longer heavy. He could almost see himself from the outside, a man who used to tremble at his daughter's disapproval now calmly dictating legal strategy. He picked up his pen and wrote defense/action at the top of a fresh page. "Thank you, Sandra," he said, his voice steadier now. "For the first time, I feel like I'm standing up for myself." "That's exactly what you're doing," she replied. "You're not a victim anymore. You're the plaintiff." After the call ended, Michael sat quietly, listening to the faint hiss of the ocean through the open window. He wasn't elated, he wasn't even angry. What he felt was something deeper, a quiet dignity, like a man finally stepping out from under a shadow. He reached for his mug, found it had gone cold, and smiled anyway. No more shaking hands, he murmured to himself. No more apologizing for being alive. Outside, a gull swooped low over the street. Michael closed his notebook with a firm snap. The legal fight would take time, but this moment was already a victory. For the first time in years, he wasn't reacting to Emily, he was acting on his own behalf. 2 days later, a pale morning sun spread over San Diego's skyline as Michael drove his small rental car downtown. His palms were a little damp on the steering wheel, though he tried to tell himself there was nothing to fear. The U.S. consulate building loomed ahead, a block of glass and steel with the flag flapping crisply in the breeze. He parked, straightened his shirt collar, and took a slow breath before walking up the steps. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of coffee and polished marble. Security guards checked his ID and led him through a metal detector. "You're here for a medical evaluation, sir?" one asked kindly. Michael nodded, handing over the appointment letter. "Right this way." They directed him down a quiet corridor lined with framed photos of American landscapes, the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, the Statue of Liberty. He thought of how many times he'd felt proud to be a citizen, and now here he was, proving his sanity to defend himself from his own child's accusations. The examining doctor was waiting in a private office. Dr. Benjamin Harris was in his late 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a slow, deliberate way of speaking. He shook Michael's hand firmly. "Mr. Turner, please, sit down. I've reviewed the background briefly. This won't be invasive. We'll talk, we'll run some tests, and you'll be on your way." For the next 3 hours, Michael underwent a series of evaluations, memory exercises, blood pressure, reflexes, even a full medical history. Dr. Harris asked about his daily routine, his decision-making process, his relocation to California. Michael answered steadily, though at times his voice wavered with a quiet hurt. "My daughter told a social worker I'm suffering from dementia," he said at one point. "It's not true. I'm building a new life." Dr. Harris listened carefully, his pen scratching across a yellow legal pad. Finally he set the pen down and looked Michael straight in the eye. "Mr. Turner, you're entirely lucid. Your recall is excellent, your reasoning sound, your health stable for your age. These decisions you're making, moving, managing finances, setting boundaries, they're not signs of decline. They're signs of courage." Michael felt his chest loosen, like a knot slowly untangling. "So the report. I'll send it directly to the agency that contacted you," Dr. Harris said. "It will state clearly that the accusations are baseless." He offered his hand again. "You've done nothing wrong, and you don't have to feel ashamed for protecting yourself." When Michael left the consulate, the flag still fluttered overhead, but the world looked a little brighter. The ocean breeze had picked up, carrying the sound of gulls from the bay. He sat in his car for a moment, both hands on the wheel, and let out a deep, shaky laugh. It felt like winning a quiet but important battle, not against Emily, but against the fear she had planted in him. That evening, back in his Mission Valley apartment, he opened his laptop. The sun was setting outside, painting the room gold. He began to type, not an email to Emily but a public post for fathers like him, men who had been used, shamed, and doubted by the children they'd sacrificed for. He wrote about his journey, from the day of Emily's birthday to this moment of vindication. He described the tests, the false accusations, and the relief of being told, "You are sane, you are brave." He ended the piece with a quiet hope: if you're reading this and you feel trapped, know that you're not alone. Boundaries aren't selfish. They're survival. When he hit save, a sense of calm washed over him. The past still hurt, but tonight, he felt clear, steady, and just a little bit free. Michael's fingers trembled slightly as he clicked publish. The article he had written the night before sat now on the homepage of Retirees Speak Out, a modest but growing blog for older Americans to share their experiences. The title read, "When Love Becomes Control, A Father's Journey to Freedom." He expected a few polite comments, maybe a handful of emails. What he didn't expect was the avalanche. By the next morning, his inbox was overflowing. The blog's comment section filled with stories that mirrored his own, like echoes coming back across a canyon. There were grandmothers from Minnesota, divorced fathers from Florida, widows from Texas. One woman wrote, "My son calls only when his rent is due. I thought saying no made me a bad mother. Thank you for showing me it doesn't." Another wrote simply, "You just described my life. I cried reading this." Michael scrolled through the messages at his small kitchen table, a mug of coffee warming his hand. The sun poured through the sliding door, casting a pale square of light on the floor. Each story tightened his throat. He had felt so alone that night in Columbus, clutching a cake while his daughter told him to die. Now he realized he was part of a hidden army of parents living the same pain. 2 days later, his phone rang with a California area code he didn't recognize. "Mr. Turner? This is Carla from the Gray Matters podcast. We read your piece. Would you be willing to share your story on air?" Michael hesitated, looking out at the palm trees swaying against the blue sky. "I'm not sure I'm interesting enough," he said with a dry laugh. "Trust me," Carla replied. "You're exactly who our listeners need to hear." The next week, he found himself in a small recording studio downtown. A pair of headphones pressed gently against his ears. Carla's warm voice guided him through his story, the sacrifices, the birthday, the decision to walk away. "What would you tell another parent who feels trapped?" she asked. Michael swallowed, then said softly, "That you're not selfish for saving yourself. Boundaries are love, too. Sometimes the hardest thing a parent can do is stop enabling." When the episode aired, it spread far beyond what either of them expected. Clips of his interview were shared on Facebook groups, retirement forums, even TikTok accounts run by younger people trying to understand their parents. Strangers began emailing him directly, long, vulnerable notes of gratitude. One evening, as he scrolled through yet another wave of messages, a familiar name appeared, Daniel Turner. He clicked it open, heart thudding. Emily's husband had written a quiet confession, "Michael, I saw everything. The manipulation, the threats. I didn't stop it. I was scared. I'm sorry. I want to be a better father to my boys. Please forgive me." Michael stared at the screen for a long time. Old anger and sadness flickered, but he also felt an unexpected tenderness. He typed back only one line, "Be the husband and father they need. Teach them gratitude before it's too late." Then he pressed send and closed the laptop. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled. He wasn't going back to Ohio. He wasn't reopening old wounds. But tonight, for the first time in years, he felt absolutely certain of himself. He wasn't crazy, he wasn't cruel, and he wasn't alone. He had been right to draw the line. As the sun dipped behind the Pacific, turning the sky a soft orange, Michael stepped onto his balcony. The breeze lifted his hair, carrying the faint sound of children laughing in the distance. He smiled, not at revenge or vindication, but at the quiet knowledge that his story had become a lifeline for others, a ripple turning into a wave. 6 months had passed since Michael Turner had closed the door on his old life. The San Diego sun had etched its warmth into his days, and his routines had become steady: morning walks along the boardwalk, Spanish lessons, ocean air filling his lungs. One cool April afternoon, while he was watering the potted succulents on his balcony, his phone buzzed with a message from Sandra Lewis, his attorney in Columbus. "Call me when you can. Some updates on the house." He stepped inside, sat at his small kitchen table, and dialed. "Sandra? Everything okay?" She sounded almost cheerful. "More than okay. The bank has officially foreclosed on Emily and Daniel's house. They've moved into a small apartment near Grove City. And," she paused for effect, "we've completed the sale of your share. After legal fees, you're getting a wire transfer of $95,000. Combined with your existing investments, you're now comfortably over $400,000 in assets." Michael held the phone to his ear, eyes fixed on the framed photograph of the Pacific Ocean above his sofa. He felt no glee at the news of his daughter's hardship, only a somber kind of justice. "So," he said quietly, "they're finally standing on their own." "That's right," Sandra replied. "They'll have to. You've done everything you could." He thanked her and ended the call. For a long moment he sat in silence, the muted sound of waves rolling through his open window. Then he stood, went to the fridge, and pulled out a chilled bottle of champagne he had been saving for no particular occasion. He popped the cork and poured himself a glass, the bubbles rising like tiny fireworks. Out on the balcony, the sun was sinking into the Pacific, painting the sky orange and pink. Michael raised his glass toward the horizon. "To endings," he murmured, "and beginnings." He thought of the man he had been, the father clutching a birthday cake while his daughter told him to die. That man had vanished somewhere between Dayton and California, replaced by someone steadier, freer. He now had real friends, a small circle who knew him not as a wallet but as Michael. He had written words that had reached thousands. And, perhaps most importantly, he had discovered that love without boundaries was not love at all, it was servitude. 3 years later, on an unremarkable Tuesday morning, the mail carrier slid a thick envelope under his door. Michael picked it up, noticing the familiar Ohio return address written in a neat, childish hand. He sat down on the edge of his bed and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from his eldest grandson. "Dear Grandpa, Mom told us some things, but we've been reading your articles. We're proud of you. We hope one day we can visit California and see the ocean with you." Michael's eyes blurred as he read. He pressed the paper to his chest. A single tear rolled down his cheek, then another. He wasn't crying out of regret, but out of relief, the kind that comes when you realize you didn't destroy a bridge, you built a new one. He whispered to himself, "Disappearing was the gift I gave my daughter." But this, he looked around his small, sunlit apartment, the surfboards leaning in the corner, the Spanish books on his desk, the letter trembling in his hands. "This is the gift I gave myself." Outside, the ocean roared softly, as if in agreement. Michael raised the letter toward the window and let the golden light spill over it. He felt, finally, wholly reborn. Michael stayed on the balcony long after the sun dipped below the horizon. The letter from his grandson rested on his lap, its pages fluttering softly in the evening breeze. Below, the streetlights of Mission Valley flickered on one by one, and somewhere in the distance a child laughed, the same sound he had once thought he'd lost forever. He poured a second glass of champagne, not to celebrate Emily's downfall but to honor his own rebirth. For the first time in decades, he felt whole. He thought back over the road that had brought him here, the birthday in Ohio where a simple cake turned into heartbreak, the long drive through rain replaying every dollar sacrificed, the night he told himself he would disappear, the small but radical steps, closing accounts, rewriting the will, moving to California, the podcast, the letters from strangers, the quiet victory at the consulate. Each step had felt impossible until it was done. Now, sitting in the soft coastal night, he could see the shape of the story clearly. It was never about punishing his daughter. It was about saving himself. He took a deep breath, folded the letter carefully, and placed it inside his journal. In his heart there was no triumph, only a steady peace and a promise to live the years ahead on his own terms, still open to love, but no longer at the cost of his dignity. If you have followed Michael's journey from the first chapter to this moment, you've witnessed a father move from sacrifice to self-respect, from silence to a voice that resonates with thousands. His story is not just about one family, it's about boundaries, courage, and the possibility of starting over at any age. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need hope, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. And leave a comment saying, "I'm listening." Your words help keep these stories alive and help us stay connected with you. See you in the next video.